Picture a woman drowning in Lake Michigan. She's 50 feet from shore. Lifeguards are watching. They don't move. She's screaming, flailing, going under. The lifeguards stand there with their arms crossed. Why? Her swimsuit shows her knees. If they save her, they have to arrest her. If they arrest her, they have to see her knees up close, which makes them complicit in her indecency. So they let her drown. America in the 1920s passed laws so detached from human reality that people died enforcing them, lives were destroyed following them, and the government called it progress. These are the 15 weirdest laws of the 1920s, and most of them stayed on the books for decades. Law number 1. Ice cream sodas were illegal on Sundays in Kansas. Not because of the ice cream, because of the soda. Religious groups argued that carbonation was too pleasurable for the Lord's Day. The penalty was $100, equivalent to $1,600 today. So soda fountains invented the sundae, ice cream with syrup but no carbonation. They deliberately misspelled it SUNDAE to avoid legal liability for advertising Sunday treats. American dessert culture was permanently altered because Kansas decided bubbles were sinful. Dozens of people were arrested. Shop owners paid thousands in fines, all because someone decided joy had a carbonation limit. Law number 2. Women couldn't wear swimsuits that exposed their knees in Atlantic City. Police officers patrolled beaches with measuring tapes. If the gap between your swimsuit hem and your knee exceeded 1 inch, you got arrested. In 1921, the Atlantic City Beach Patrol arrested 42 women in a single day. The measuring process was public humiliation. Officers would make women stand in front of crowds while they measured leg exposure with metal rulers. Some women were forced to wear mandatory cover-ups, basically burlap sacks provided by the city. Others were escorted off the beach entirely. The law stayed on the books until 1937. 16 years of measuring women's knees on public beaches because someone decided female kneecaps were threats to public morality. Law number 3. You couldn't teach evolution in Tennessee. The Scopes monkey trial made headlines, but the law was real and enforced. Teachers were fired, curricula were censored, textbooks were literally redacted with black ink. John Scopes was convicted and fined $100. The law wasn't symbolic. It was criminal statute. Teaching that humans evolved from earlier species was a misdemeanor punishable by fines up to $500. That's $8,000 today for explaining biology. The law wasn't repealed until 1967, 4 decades where Tennessee classrooms were legally required to teach that evolutionary science was false. Generations of students were deliberately miseducated because religious groups had legislative power. Law number 4. Flirting in New York State could get you 90 days in jail. Not harassment. Not assault. Flirting. The law defined flirting as any gesture, look, or comment that suggested romantic or sexual interest without explicit prior consent. How do you prove consent to a look? You couldn't, which meant enforcement was arbitrary. In practice, the law was used almost exclusively against women. Men claimed women's glances were inappropriate advances. Women got arrested for making eye contact. Between 1920 and 1925, New York courts processed over 300 flirting cases. The conviction rate was 67%. Women served jail time for smiling at the wrong person. Law number 5. It was illegal to slurp soup in New Jersey. The law specified that audible consumption of liquids in public eating establishments constituted disturbing the peace. Restaurants were required to post signs. Silent dining enforced. Police could issue citations for slurping, and they did. Court records from 1923 show 17 people were fined $25 each for soup-related noise violations in Newark alone. The law was used disproportionately against immigrants, particularly Italian and Jewish communities whose eating customs included sounds. The quiet dining law wasn't about manners, it was ethnic harassment with legal paperwork. Law number 6. Dancing cheek to cheek was illegal in 13 states. The laws specified that dancers must maintain a 6-inch gap between their bodies at all times. Dance halls employed monitors, adults who walked between dancing couples with rulers, measuring the space between them. If you were too close, the music stopped, the lights came on, and you were escorted out. In Utah, violators could be fined $299. Some dance halls installed rope barriers that hung between partners to enforce the distance requirement. You danced with a rope between you and your date. The law wasn't about preventing intimacy. Married couples were subject to the same rules. It was about control, about making sure young people understood that joy required permission, that even movement was subject to state regulation. Law number 7. Women couldn't wear red lipstick in Carrizozo, New Mexico, without a special permit. The permit cost $5, had to be renewed annually, and required a written explanation of why you needed to wear red lipstick specifically. The law classified red lipstick as a form of public disguise, arguing that it fundamentally altered a woman's appearance and therefore constituted deception. Women who wore red lipstick without permits faced $50 fines. Between 1925 and 1928, the town issued exactly 0 permits and collected over $2,000 in fines. The law wasn't enforcement, it was revenue generation disguised as morality legislation. Law number 8. Sneezing in church was illegal in Omaha, Nebraska. The law was passed in 1927 after a flu outbreak. City officials argued that sneezing in enclosed spaces during religious services endangered public health. The penalty was $25 or 3 days in jail. Church attendance dropped 40% in 6 months. People were terrified of involuntary bodily functions. Imagine sitting in a pew, feeling a sneeze coming, and knowing you might go to jail if you can't stop it. The law was repealed in 1929, but only after public health officials confirmed it had 0 impact on flu transmission and significant impact on religious participation. Law number 9. It was illegal to fall asleep in a cheese factory in South Dakota. The law was passed after a worker fell asleep and a batch of cheese spoiled, costing the factory $800. The state legislature decided the solution was criminalizing tiredness. Workers caught sleeping faced termination and a $50 fine. The law applied even during breaks. You could eat lunch in the factory, but you couldn't close your eyes. Factory owners used the law to eliminate rest periods entirely. Why allow breaks if workers can't rest? Cheese factory employees in South Dakota worked 14-hour shifts with no legal protection for sleep. The law wasn't about cheese quality, it was about normalizing exhaustion. Law number 10. Women couldn't drive cars in Memphis without a man walking in front of the vehicle waving a red flag. The law was passed in 1923 and stayed active until 1927. The stated purpose was safety. Women were considered too emotionally unstable to operate vehicles without male supervision. The flag carrier had to walk at least 50 feet ahead, waving a red cloth to warn pedestrians that a woman driver was approaching. In practice, this made driving impossible. You needed to hire a man just to use your own car. Women who drove without flag carriers were arrested for reckless endangerment. The law wasn't about safety. It was about making car ownership so burdensome for women that they'd give up. It worked. Female car ownership in Memphis dropped 73% between 1923 and 1926. Law number 11. Ugly people couldn't appear in public in Chicago. The law was called the Ugly Law, and it was real. The official language prohibited any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way to appear in public spaces. The penalty was arrest and a fine up to $50 or imprisonment up to 90 days. Who decided what counted as ugly? Police officers. Enforcement was arbitrary, cruel, and targeted people with disabilities, facial differences, or visible injuries. One woman with a port wine birthmark was arrested 7 times in 2 years for walking to work. A man who lost an arm in a factory accident was prohibited from attending his own daughter's school play because his appearance might disturb other parents. The law wasn't repealed in Chicago until 1974. 5 decades where visible difference was literally criminal. Law number 12. It was illegal to whistle underwater in Vermont. Nobody knows why this law was passed. There's no legislative record explaining the purpose. But it was real statute, active from 1921 through 1967. Obviously, enforcement was impossible. You can't whistle underwater. Physics doesn't allow it. But that's the point. The law's existence proved that legislatures were passing regulations without logic, without reason, without any connection to reality. Vermont had a law on the books for 46 years that prohibited a physical impossibility, and nobody cared enough to remove it. That's not quirky. That's a government so detached from reality that nonsense becomes law and stays law for half a century. Law number 13. Owning a bathtub was illegal in Virginia until you proved you'd use it for laundry, not bathing. The law was passed in 1920 after moral reformers argued that bathtubs encouraged vanity and leisurely behavior. To own a bathtub legally, you had to register it with the county, pay a $5 annual fee, and sign an affidavit swearing the tub would only be used for washing clothes. Inspectors could enter homes without warrants to verify bathtub usage. If they found evidence of bathing, soap residue, damp towels, warm water, the tub was confiscated and you were fined $100. Between 1920 and 1926, Virginia confiscated over 400 bathtubs. Families lost basic sanitation infrastructure because the state decided cleanliness was moral corruption. The law was repealed in 1926 after a typhoid outbreak that health officials directly linked to reduced bathing. Law number 14. It was illegal to sell baby dolls that cried, talked, or made any sound in Cleveland. The law passed in 1924 after complaints that mechanical dolls frightened children and caused nightmares. Toy stores were raided. Inventory was confiscated. One shop owner was fined $200 for selling 3 crying dolls. The law stayed active until 1931, when the Great Depression made toy regulations seem absurd, even by 1920s standards. For 7 years, Cleveland children were legally prohibited from owning dolls that made noise. The free market met government regulation, and the government won. Law number 15. Laughing in church was a criminal offense in Alabama. The law specified that any audible expression of amusement during religious services constituted disrupting worship and was punishable by $50 fine or 30 days in jail. Children were not exempt. In 1926, a 12-year-old boy was fined $50 after laughing during a sermon when the preacher's toupee fell off mid-sentence. The family couldn't pay. The boy served 12 days in county jail for laughing at a wig. The law wasn't about reverence. It was about establishing that the state could regulate emotion, that your internal experience, your involuntary responses, your basic humanity was subject to government approval. The law was repealed in 1968. 4 decades where joy was criminal in Alabama churches. These laws destroyed lives. They generated millions in fines that funded corrupt city budgets. They normalized government intrusion into private life. They established that your body, your movement, your expression, your basic existence could be regulated, measured, controlled, and punished. The 1920s weren't about freedom. They were about control dressed up as morality. These laws prove it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video, because everything you think you know about the 1920s is wrong, and we're exposing all of it.